In the autumn of 1940, as German bombers filled the skies over London and the British Empire stood alone against the Nazi war machine, a man walked into the War Office with an unusual proposal. His name was Jasper Maskelyne, and he carried with him not weapons or strategic plans, but the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations of theatrical illusion. He believed that the techniques that had amazed audiences in the great theaters of London and New York could be adapted to confuse and deceive the enemy. He believed that magic could win the war. What followed would become one of the most debated stories of the Second World War, a tale where truth and illusion became so entangled that historians would spend decades trying to separate fact from fiction. This is the story of Jasper Maskelyne, the war magician, and the question that haunts his legacy. Did he really help deceive the Nazis, or did he deceive us all? To understand Jasper Maskelyne, one must first understand the weight of the name he carried. The Maskelyne family was not merely famous in the world of stage magic, they were royalty. For nearly a century, the name Maskelyne had been synonymous with the highest quality of theatrical illusion in the English-speaking world. It began with John Neville Maskelyne, Jasper's grandfather, born in 1839 in Cheltenham, England. John Neville was a watchmaker by trade, a man of precise mechanical skill and scientific curiosity. In 1865, he attended a performance by the Davenport brothers, American spiritualists who claimed to communicate with the dead through paranormal means. The Davenports would be tied up in a cabinet, and while bound, musical instruments would play, bells would ring, and spirit hands would appear, all in complete darkness. John Neville Maskelyne was not impressed by the spirits. He was impressed by the deception. With his watchmaker's eye for mechanism and his rational mind, he quickly deduced how the tricks were performed. Rather than simply expose the fraud, he decided to recreate it, not as spiritualism but as honest theatrical entertainment. He partnered with a cabinet maker named George Alfred Cook, and together they began performing their own version of the cabinet trick, making it clear to audiences that what they were witnessing was skilled illusion, not supernatural phenomenon. This philosophy, that magic should astonish but never pretend to be real supernatural power, became the foundation of the Maskelyne tradition. John Neville and Cook opened their first performance venue in 1873 at the Egyptian Hall on Piccadilly in London, a building that would become legendary in the history of magic. For the next 30 years, the Egyptian Hall was the premier destination for illusion entertainment in the British Empire. John Neville Maskelyne became famous not just for his performances, but for his inventions. He created elaborate automata, including the famous Psycho, a whist-playing automaton that seemed to possess genuine artificial intelligence. He invented coin-operated locks for public toilets, a device still in use today. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society, a man who bridged the worlds of entertainment and scientific ingenuity. John Neville's son, Neville Maskelyne, was born in 1863 and naturally followed his father into the family business. Neville developed his own performance style, equally committed to the principle of honest deception, spectacular illusions presented as skillful craft rather than mystical power. When the Egyptian Hall finally closed in 1904, Neville opened a new venue, St. George's Hall on Langham Place, which continued the Maskelyne tradition of daily performances for decades. Into this world of spotlight and secret machinery, Jasper Maskelyne was born on September 20, 1902. From his earliest memories, magic was not something mystical or distant. It was the family trade, as concrete as carpentry or medicine might be in other households. He grew up backstage at St. George's Hall, watching his father and grandfather perform, learning the mechanics of illusion before he could properly read. The scent of grease paint, the heat of the limelight, the gasps of audiences, these were the textures of his childhood. But being a third-generation Maskelyne carried expectations as heavy as the name was prestigious. Jasper was not just learning magic, he was inheriting a legacy. Every performance would be measured against his grandfather's inventions and his father's refinements. The pressure to live up to the Maskelyne name would shape his entire life, driving both his genuine accomplishments and, later, his exaggerations. Jasper's education in illusion was comprehensive. He learned the fundamental principles that had been refined over generations: misdirection, timing, mechanical ingenuity, understanding of human psychology, and above all, showmanship. He learned that the secret of a good illusion was not just the method, but the presentation, the story you told with your body, your voice, your entire being. An illusion was a kind of theater where the plot was impossible, and the audience's willing suspension of disbelief was the prize you earned through skill and charisma. By his early 20s, Jasper had developed into a competent professional magician. He was tall and handsome with sharp features and an aristocratic bearing that served him well on stage. He married Evelyn Hay in 1928, and they had a son, Alistair, born in 1929. He performed regularly, both under the Maskelyne banner and independently, touring Britain and occasionally venturing abroad. His act included many of the classic illusions refined by his grandfather and father, but he also worked to develop his own signature pieces. However, Jasper lived in the long shadow of his predecessors. He was skilled, certainly, but he lacked his grandfather's mechanical genius and his father's effortless stage presence. Reviews of his performances were generally positive but rarely ecstatic. He was often described as a competent or professional magician, respectable praise, but not the language of greatness. For a man carrying the Maskelyne name, being merely competent was a kind of failure. The 1930s were difficult years for the theatrical magic business. The novelty of cinema was drawing audiences away from live entertainment. Economic depression meant fewer people could afford theater tickets. The Maskelyne empire, while still respected, was not the dominant force it had once been. Jasper found work, but he was not a star. He performed at provincial theaters, private parties, and corporate events. Honest work, but a far cry from the glory days of the Egyptian Hall. Then came September 1939, and everything changed. Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. The theaters of London began to empty as young men enlisted or were conscripted. The world of theatrical illusion suddenly seemed frivolous in the face of existential threat. Jasper Maskelyne was 37 years old, married with a young son, and watching his career and his country face uncertain futures. It was in this moment that an idea began to form in his mind, an idea that would define the rest of his life and create a legend that would outlive him. The early months of the war, the period that would later be called the Phony War, saw Britain mobilizing but not yet fully engaged in combat. Young men enlisted in droves, driven by patriotism, duty, or simply the desire to be part of something larger than themselves. Jasper Maskelyne, approaching his 38th birthday, was beyond the age of automatic conscription, but he felt the pull nonetheless. His motivations were complex. There was genuine patriotism, certainly. The Maskelynes were a family of English tradition, and the Nazi threat was real and terrifying. But there was also something else: opportunity. Here was a chance to prove himself, to step out of the shadow of his famous grandfather and do something that no Maskelyne had ever done before. The war offered the possibility of relevance, of importance, of making the Maskelyne name mean something new. In early 1940, Jasper began approaching military authorities with a proposition. He argued that the techniques of stage magic, misdirection, false perspective, lighting manipulation, mechanical deception, could be adapted for military purposes. In particular, he suggested that illusion principles could enhance camouflage techniques and military deception operations. It was an audacious idea, and initially, it was met with skepticism. The British military establishment in 1940 was not particularly receptive to unconventional ideas from civilian entertainers. The officer class was still largely drawn from traditional military families and public schools, men who valued discipline, hierarchy, and conventional thinking. The notion that a stage magician might have something valuable to contribute to modern warfare seemed to many absurd. However, Britain in 1940 was also desperate. The evacuation at Dunkirk had occurred in late May and early June, with the British Expeditionary Force barely escaping annihilation. France had fallen. The Battle of Britain was being fought in the skies. Invasion seemed imminent. In such circumstances, even unconventional ideas deserved consideration. Jasper's persistence eventually paid off. In the exact details of how he gained entry into military service, the historical record becomes somewhat murky, a pattern that would repeat throughout his war story. According to his later accounts, he had to fight through layers of bureaucracy and skepticism before finally convincing someone of authority that his skills were valuable. Whether this process was as dramatic as he later claimed is uncertain, but by late 1940 he had enlisted in the Royal Engineers, the branch of the British Army responsible for military engineering, construction, and technical support. The Royal Engineers had a long and distinguished history dating back to the 18th century. They were responsible for building fortifications, bridges, and roads, for demolitions and mine warfare, and increasingly for military camouflage. Camouflage as a military discipline had developed significantly during the First World War, when the static nature of trench warfare made concealment a matter of life and death. By the Second World War, the Royal Engineers included specialized camouflage units that used techniques including netting, paint, false structures, and dummy installations to hide real military assets and create false ones. This was the context into which Maskelyne entered. He was assigned to a camouflage training center, initially in England, where his theatrical background was considered relevant to the work of deception. It's important to understand that Maskelyne was not inventing camouflage or military deception. These disciplines already existed with their own techniques and experts. What Maskelyne offered was a slightly different perspective, one informed by stage illusion principles. For several months, Maskelyne worked at this training center, teaching principles of visual deception to soldiers. He demonstrated how lighting could hide or reveal objects, how false perspective could make near things appear far and large things appear small, how attention could be directed toward decoys and away from genuine targets. These were real contributions, modest but useful, applying theatrical knowledge to military problems. However, this was not the dramatic, war-changing role that Maskelyne had envisioned for himself. Teaching camouflage to new recruits in the English countryside was valuable work, but it was not glamorous. It was not the kind of achievement that would make the Maskelyne name legendary. And so, like many ambitious soldiers, Maskelyne sought transfer to where the real action was, North Africa. By 1941, the North African campaign had become the primary theater where British ground forces were engaged with the enemy. The Desert War was fought across the vast expanses of Libya and Egypt, with the vital Suez Canal and access to Middle Eastern oil as the ultimate strategic prizes. British and Commonwealth forces under various commanders fought against the German Afrika Korps led by Erwin Rommel and Italian forces. The fluid, mobile nature of desert warfare made camouflage and deception particularly relevant. There was little natural cover, distances were vast, and air reconnaissance was critical. Maskelyne applied for transfer to North Africa, and in 1941 his request was granted. He was sent to Cairo, which served as the headquarters for British Middle East Command. Here he would join the camouflage operations that were already underway. And here, the story of Jasper Maskelyne begins to transform from documented history into something more complicated, a mixture of fact, exaggeration, and myth. Cairo in 1941 was a city of contrasts and contradictions. It was the nerve center of British operations in the Middle East, bustling with soldiers, officers, intelligence agents, and all the apparatus of modern war. Yet it was also a place of astonishing luxury compared to battered Britain. Restaurants and nightclubs operated, alcohol flowed, and for those with money or connections, the war could seem distant despite the German threat just a few hundred miles to the west. Into this environment came Jasper Maskelyne, no longer a struggling provincial magician but a military officer with specialized skills. Here, according to his later accounts, he would assemble what he called his magic gang, a special unit of camouflage experts who would undertake the most audacious deception operations of the war. The question of the magic gang is where historians begin to diverge sharply from Maskelyne's own narrative. According to his 1949 memoir and subsequent accounts, he personally recruited a team of specialists with theatrical and artistic backgrounds. A carpenter, a set designer, a chemist, an electrician, and others. Together, they would form an elite deception unit operating semi-independently under Maskelyne's leadership, given special authority to undertake dramatic operations. The historical reality appears to have been more mundane. Maskelyne was assigned to work with existing Royal Engineers camouflage units, which included various specialists, some with art school training, some with construction backgrounds, some with engineering expertise. These were not theatrical people recruited by Maskelyne, but military personnel who were already working on camouflage before he arrived. There is little documentary evidence of a special magic gang unit with formal authority or independence. However, there were real people who worked alongside Maskelyne in camouflage operations in North Africa. Among them was Philip Townsend, who had some background in theater and remained a lifelong friend of Maskelyne. There were various other engineers and technicians whose names appear in fragmentary records. What's unclear is whether this was an exceptional, specially authorized unit or simply a normal camouflage section of the type that existed throughout the British Army. This ambiguity, this gap between the dramatic narrative and the documentary record, is the central problem of the Maskelyne story. It's not that everything he claimed was false, it's that the truth was almost certainly less dramatic, less centralized, and less revolutionary than he portrayed it. So what did Maskelyne actually do in North Africa? The answer requires separating several different categories of operations. Things he definitely worked on, things he possibly contributed to, things he probably had nothing to do with, and things that may never have happened at all. One of the most famous operations attributed to Maskelyne involved the camouflage of Alexandria Harbor. Alexandria was Egypt's primary Mediterranean port and a crucial naval base for the British fleet. German and Italian aircraft regularly attempted bombing raids, trying to destroy British warships and disrupt supply lines. Making the harbor less visible or creating dummy targets elsewhere would have obvious strategic value. According to Maskelyne's accounts, he devised an elaborate plan to hide Alexandria harbor using a combination of techniques. The plan allegedly involved creating a false harbor several miles away, complete with dummy buildings, false ship positions indicated by lights, and even smoke effects to simulate activity. Meanwhile, the real harbor would be obscured through selective lighting blackouts and camouflage. German bombers, fooled by the false harbor, would waste their bombs on empty sand while the real fleet remains safe. This story has many elements that sound plausibly related to real camouflage theory. Creating dummy installations to draw enemy fire away from real targets was a standard deception tactic used throughout the war by all sides. Manipulating lighting to confuse aerial reconnaissance was also a real technique. And Alexandria harbor was certainly a target that needed protection. However, when military historians have examined the documentary record, air raid reports, bombing assessments, RAF intelligence summaries, they find little evidence of a successful large-scale deception of the type Maskelyne described. German bombing raids on Alexandria continued throughout 1941 and 1942, and they frequently hit their intended targets. There is no pattern suggesting that German bombers were systematically fooled by a false harbor. What probably happened is something more modest. Camouflage units in Alexandria, which would have included personnel Maskelyne worked with or knew, did employ various defensive deception techniques. Dummy positions were created in some locations. Lighting discipline was enforced. Camouflage netting was used. These were standard protective measures, competently executed by trained Royal Engineers, and they may have had some marginal effect in reducing the accuracy of night bombing raids. Maskelyne's contribution, if any, was likely as one participant among many in these routine camouflage operations. The transformation of routine defensive camouflage into a dramatic story of a master illusionist creating an entire false harbor that fooled the German Luftwaffe appears to be an embellishment, the first of many in the Maskelyne narrative. Another operation frequently credited to Maskelyne involves the Suez Canal, the vital waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and providing Britain with access to India, Asia, and oil from the Persian Gulf. The canal was one of the most strategically important locations in the entire British Empire, and its protection was an absolute priority for British Middle East Command. The Suez Canal presented unique challenges for camouflage. It was over 100 miles long, cutting through open desert and flat terrain. It was highly visible from the air, a clear line of water running through the landscape. And it was an obvious target. If the Germans could bomb the locks or sink ships in the narrow channel, they could disrupt British supply lines for months. According to Maskelyne's later accounts, he devised a remarkable solution. He would hide the canal using light. The plan supposedly involved installing a vast system of searchlights and rotating mirrors along the length of the canal. At night, when German bombers approached, the lights would be activated, creating a dazzling display that would disorient and confuse the bombardiers. The lights would create false reflections, make the pilots uncertain of their position, and generally turn the simple problem of bomb the waterway into a bewildering maze of light. Additionally, Maskelyne claimed to have created false canals elsewhere in the desert using lights and reflective materials, hoping to draw bombs away from the real target. In some versions of the story, he even claimed to have made the canal disappear by aligning lights in specific patterns that disrupted the pilot's depth perception. This story has elements that connect to real wartime techniques. Searchlights were indeed used defensively throughout the war, primarily to aid anti-aircraft gunners by illuminating enemy bombers. Dazzle techniques, using light and pattern to confuse observers, had been employed in World War I, particularly with ships using disruptive camouflage patterns. The idea of using light as a defensive tool was not inherently absurd. However, the specific operation Maskelyne described, a master system of lights and mirrors stretching for 100 miles, successfully confusing German pilots and protecting the canal, has no corroboration in military records. The Suez Canal defenses relied on more conventional methods: anti-aircraft batteries, fighter patrols, smoke generators for obscuration, and standard camouflage of specific installations like locks and port facilities. British air defense records from the period show that German air raids on the Suez Canal were relatively infrequent and generally ineffective, but this was due to the distance German bombers had to travel, the concentration of anti-aircraft defenses, and the difficulty of precision bombing at night rather than any revolutionary lighting system. When the canal was attacked, bombs fell in and around it with about the accuracy one would expect given the technology and conditions of the time. Some hits, many misses, but no evidence of pilots being systematically confused by an elaborate light show. Once again, what likely happened was much more mundane. Searchlight units did operate in the canal zone, standard military searchlights used for air defense. Camouflage personnel, possibly including Maskelyne, may have worked on concealing specific canal installations. But the grand deception Maskelyne described appears to be a dramatic inflation of routine defensive measures. To properly evaluate Maskelyne's claims, it's essential to understand that he was operating within a much larger and more sophisticated British deception apparatus. One that existed before he arrived and continued after he left. One that was run by professional military intelligence officers with carefully planned strategic goals. The British military had recognized the value of strategic deception early in the war. In 1940, a division was created within British Middle East Command specifically for deception operations. This was initially called Advanced Headquarters A Force and was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, a career intelligence officer who had served in various colonial conflicts and had a brilliant, devious mind. Dudley Clark was the real architect of strategic deception in North Africa, and his operations were far more comprehensive and sophisticated than anything Maskelyne described. Clark understood that effective deception was not just about camouflage nets and dummy tanks. It was about creating an entire false narrative in the enemy's intelligence picture. This involved coordinated efforts across multiple channels. False radio traffic, planted intelligence documents, double agents providing misleading information, dummy units with full radio signatures, carefully managed real troop movements to support false conclusions, and yes, physical deception like dummy vehicles and installations. A force, under Clark's leadership, conducted numerous deception operations throughout the North African campaign. These were carefully coordinated with actual military operations, designed to mislead the Germans about British strength, positions, and intentions. The goal was not to confuse a bomber pilot for a few minutes but to confuse the German high command for weeks or months, causing them to make strategic errors. For example, before the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942, a force worked to convince the Germans that the British attack would come from the south rather than the center. This involved not just physical dummy concentrations but false signals, deceptive supply movements, and leaked false information. Similarly, before the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, a force conducted Operation Bertram, an elaborate deception that contributed significantly to British victory, but more on that later. The point is that there was already a sophisticated, professionally led deception organization operating in North Africa when Maskelyne arrived. Camouflage units, including the ones Maskelyne worked with, supported this larger effort, but they were subordinate parts of a much bigger machine. The idea that a single-stage magician was independently designing and executing major deception operations is inconsistent with the highly structured, carefully controlled nature of actual British military deception work. Jasper Maskelyne was, at most, a junior participant in this larger effort, a captain, later major, in the Royal Engineers, contributing his particular skills to physical camouflage work that supported operations planned and directed by others. This is still honorable service, but it's not the story of a master illusionist single-handedly tricking Rommel's Afrika Korps. The Second Battle of El Alamein, fought from October 23 to November 11, 1942, was the turning point of the North African campaign. British and Commonwealth forces under General Bernard Montgomery decisively defeated Rommel's German-Italian army, beginning a retreat that would eventually drive Axis forces entirely out of Africa. It was one of Britain's most important victories of the war, and Winston Churchill famously said of it, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat." The success at El Alamein was due to multiple factors. Montgomery's careful preparation, superior numbers in men and equipment, excellent intelligence from ultra-decrypts of German communications, good logistics, and effective combined arms tactics. But deception also played a role, and this is where Jasper Maskelyne's story becomes most entangled with historical reality. Operation Bertram was the name given to the deception plan supporting Montgomery's attack at El Alamein. The plan was designed by Dudley Clark's A Force in coordination with Montgomery's staff. The strategic goal was to convince the Germans that the main British attack would come in the south of the line, while the actual main attack would come in the north. Additionally, the deception aimed to disguise the timing of the attack, making the Germans believe it would come later than it actually did. To achieve this, a complex set of measures was implemented. In the south, dummy tanks and vehicles were created to suggest a major armored concentration. In the north, where the real armored forces were assembling, they were disguised. Real tanks were hidden under camouflage that made them appear to be ordinary supply trucks. Then, as the Real tanks moved up to assault positions, Dummy tanks replaced them in the rear areas, maintaining the appearance that armor was still far from the front. Dummy artillery pieces were positioned in the south. A fake water pipeline was constructed, deliberately built at a slow pace to suggest that no attack was imminent. The Germans would presumably calculate that the British wouldn't attack until the pipeline was completed, so by making it look like the pipeline would take weeks longer, the timing of the actual attack was obscured. False radio traffic suggested movement and preparation in the south. Dummy landing craft appeared near coastal positions in the northern sector, suggesting a possible amphibious operation that might cause the Germans to hold reserves near the coast. Real supply dumps and headquarters were camouflaged or positioned to support the false southern attack narrative. Operation Bertram was a genuine success. Post-war analysis of German records shows that Rommel and his staff were indeed confused about where and when the main British attack would come. They kept substantial reserves in the south, away from where they were needed. The surprise achieved in the north contributed to the breakthrough that began the German defeat. This was real deception, professionally planned and competently executed. And now we reach the critical question. What was Jasper Maskelyne's role in it? According to Maskelyne's own accounts, he was central to Operation Bertram's success. He claimed to have designed many of the key deceptions, including the dummy tanks, the camouflage techniques that hid real tanks, and various other elements. In his telling, the Magic Gang worked tirelessly to construct the vast array of decoys that fooled Rommel, and their contribution was essential to Montgomery's victory. The historical evidence suggests something different. Operation Bertram was planned by a force, specifically by Clark and his staff in coordination with Montgomery's operational planners. The physical implementation of the dummy installations was carried out by various Royal Engineers camouflage units. Multiple sections working across the front, not a single Magic Gang unit. Maskelyne was a serving officer in Royal Engineers camouflage during this period, so he was almost certainly involved in some aspects of the work. He may have supervised construction of some dummy positions. He may have contributed technical advice on specific camouflage techniques. But the documentary evidence does not support his claim of central importance. The dummy tanks used at El Alamein were of a type called sunshields, collapsible frameworks covered with painted canvas that could be placed over real tanks to make them look like trucks, or erected in empty positions to make empty ground look like it contained tanks. These sunshields were designed by Royal Engineers camouflage specialists before Maskelyne arrived in North Africa, based on techniques developed earlier in the war. They were a standard piece of equipment, manufactured in workshops and issued to units as needed. Similarly, the fake water pipeline was an engineer construction project, executed by field companies of the Royal Engineers under operational planning from headquarters staff. There's no evidence that it involved any particularly innovative theatrical techniques. It was simply a pipeline that wasn't connected to anything built. Conspicuously enough that German air reconnaissance would photograph it. After the war, in official histories and memoirs by the actual planners of Operation Bertram, including Dudley Clark's own memoirs and various Royal Engineers histories, Jasper Maskelyne is not mentioned. This is striking. If he had truly been central to the operation's success, one would expect his name to appear in these accounts. The absence of any mention suggests that his role was peripheral at most. This doesn't mean Maskelyne did nothing at El Alamein. He was there, he was working in camouflage, and his unit contributed to the overall effort. But there's a vast difference between participated in implementing a larger plan and designed and executed the deception that won the battle. Maskelyne claimed the latter. The evidence supports only the former. To understand what camouflage work in North Africa actually involved, it's worth examining the practical techniques used and how they related to Maskelyne's claimed expertise. The creation of dummy military equipment was a substantial industry during World War II, conducted by all major combatants. The goal was to create false targets that would appear genuine to enemy reconnaissance, whether visual observation, aerial photography, or, later in the war, radar. The effectiveness of a dummy depended on fooling the enemy's intelligence-gathering systems long enough to achieve a strategic or tactical advantage. Dummy tanks in North Africa were generally constructed using three approaches. The first was the sunshield, already mentioned, a light framework that could be erected over a real vehicle to change its apparent shape. These were relatively sophisticated, requiring careful attention to the visual profile from air observation. The second was the static dummy, a framework of wood or metal tubing covered with canvas and painted to resemble a tank when viewed from above. These were cheaper and faster to produce but couldn't move. The third was the converted vehicle, a real truck with framework added to make it look like a tank from the air. Each approach had advantages and limitations. Sunshields allowed real tanks to hide in plain sight but required the tanks to remain relatively stationary. Static dummies were easy to deploy in large numbers but couldn't simulate movement. Converted trucks could simulate armor on the move but wouldn't fool close inspection. The construction of these devices required skills in carpentry, metalwork, canvas work, and painting, precisely the kinds of skills that theater set designers and prop makers possessed. This is the genuine connection between Maskelyne's theatrical background and military camouflage work. The Magic Gang story, insofar as there's truth in it, probably reflects that Maskelyne and perhaps a few colleagues with theatrical experience were particularly adept at this kind of construction work. However, they were not the only people doing it, nor were they doing it in isolation. Royal Engineers camouflage units across all theaters of war were building dummy installations using the same techniques. Standard designs and specifications existed. Workshops in Cairo and Alexandria produced dummies on an almost industrial scale. What Maskelyne was doing was craft work, valuable craft work, but not revolutionary innovation. The same applies to camouflage techniques for concealing real equipment. The primary methods involved netting, disrupting patterns, and positioning. Camouflage nets, often garnished with natural materials like scrub brush in desert environments, could break up the distinctive outline of vehicles and installations. Paint patterns using contrasting colors could disrupt the shape recognition that photo interpreters relied on. Careful positioning, taking advantage of shadows, terrain features, and sun angles, could make objects much harder to spot from the air. These techniques benefited from understanding visual perception and the principles of light and shadow, areas where Maskelyne's stage experience was genuinely relevant. A stage magician understands how audiences see, how attention is directed, how visual expectations can be manipulated. These insights could indeed enhance conventional camouflage work. But again, this represents competent professional contribution, not miraculous innovation. The gap between useful expertise in visual deception and master illusionist who single-handedly fooled the Afrika Korps is vast. Among Maskelyne's most dramatic claims was the creation of an entire phantom army, a complete fake military formation including thousands of dummy vehicles, fake supply dumps, false headquarters with radio traffic, dummy landing craft, and all the infrastructure of a military force that existed only in German intelligence reports. This story has some basis in real deception operations, but once again Maskelyne's role appears to have been inflated beyond recognition. The British did create notional, fake, military formations as part of their deception planning. The most famous example was the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, the Phantom Army created to support the D-Day deception in 1944, supposedly poised to invade the Pas-de-Calais while the real invasion hit Normandy. Similar, smaller-scale notional units were created in North Africa and elsewhere. These phantom armies were complex creations requiring coordination across multiple deception channels. Physical evidence like dummy vehicles and camps was only one element. Equally important were signals deception, creating appropriate radio traffic, administrative deception, creating paper trails of supplies and requisitions, and intelligence deception, feeding false information through double agents and allowing certain information to be discovered by enemy intelligence. The creation of such notional forces was the work of high-level deception planners like Dudley Clark, not field-level camouflage officers. The physical dummies were the least sophisticated part, mere props in a much larger theater of deception. A force would determine what phantom formation needed to be created and where it should appear to be located. Then various operational units would execute the plan. Signal specialists would handle radio traffic, camouflage units would build physical dummies, intelligence officers would manage the information channels. If Maskelyne participated in creating physical elements of a phantom army, he would have been following orders and specifications provided by a force planners. The strategic deception concept was not his, the overall coordination was not his, and the sophisticated intelligence elements were certainly not his. He may have built some of the props, but he didn't write the script or direct the play. This distinction is crucial for understanding Maskelyne's actual contribution versus his claimed contribution. His skills were real and valuable at the tactical level. The physical construction of convincing dummies, the placement of camouflage, the understanding of visual deception. But he was not operating at the strategic level where decisions about what deceptions to conduct and how they integrated into overall military operations were made. Despite the exaggerations and uncertainties surrounding specific operations, it's worth examining what genuine techniques from stage magic might have been applicable to military deception, because this reveals both the potential value of Maskelyne's expertise and the limits of that value. Stage magic relies on several fundamental principles that could theoretically translate to military application. The first is misdirection, drawing attention to one thing while the important action happens elsewhere. In a stage act, a magician might make a grand gesture with one hand while the other hand executes the secret move. In military terms, this could translate to creating an obvious decoy that draws enemy reconnaissance attention while the real preparation happens elsewhere. The second principle is false perspective and forced viewpoint. Stage magicians use carefully controlled viewing angles, knowing exactly where the audience is positioned. They use false depths, painted backgrounds, and clever positioning to make objects appear different from what they are. In military camouflage, this could translate to designing dummies and camouflage specifically for the expected reconnaissance method, air photography from certain altitudes, for instance. The third principle is the exploitation of assumptions. Magicians understand that audiences make logical assumptions, and by controlling what the audience sees, you can cause them to draw false conclusions. A box appears solid because solid boxes are normal, therefore it must be solid. In military terms, this meant understanding what enemy intelligence analysts expected to see and carefully presenting evidence that would confirm false expectations. The fourth principle is timing and attention management. A magician controls the pace of a performance, knowing when to act and when to wait, when to draw attention and when to let it wander. In deception operations, this could translate to carefully phased operations, revealing elements of a deception at the right pace to build a convincing false narrative. These principles were genuinely applicable to military deception, and Maskelyne's understanding of them was potentially valuable. However, they were not unknown to military professionals. Conventional camouflage doctrine already incorporated many of these concepts, developed through years of practical experience rather than theatrical training. Where Maskelyne might have made genuine contributions was in specific technical solutions. For example, his understanding of stage lighting could have informed defensive lighting schemes that made facilities harder to see at night while still allowing work to continue. His knowledge of forced perspective could have refined the design of dummies to be more convincing from expected observation angles. His experience with mechanical effects could have helped in creating dummies that simulated movement or activity. These are real skills, and in a competent officer, they could enhance the work of a camouflage unit. But they don't add up to the revolutionary transformation of warfare that Maskelyne later claimed. They represent the professional application of specialized knowledge to military problems, valuable but not miraculous. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Maskelyne story from a historian's perspective is the scarcity of contemporaneous documentation that supports his claims. This requires careful examination because the absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. But in this case, the pattern of documentation gaps is revealing. 4 operations Maskelyne claimed were of major strategic importance. One would expect multiple forms of documentation to exist in military archives. There should be planning documents showing the operational concept and authorization. There should be after-action reports assessing effectiveness. There should be records of resources allocated, personnel assigned, materials requisitioned, funding authorized. There should be references in higher headquarters documentation and in the records of units that were supposedly deceived. For most of Maskelyne's claimed operations, these documents either don't exist or don't mention him. This is particularly striking for Operation Bertram, which is extensively documented as a genuine, successful deception operation. The planning papers exist. The after-action reports exist. The German intelligence assessments that show they were deceived exist. But in none of this official documentation does Jasper Maskelyne's name appear as a key planner or executor. One possible explanation is that his operations were so secret that they were kept out of normal documentation. This is the explanation Maskelyne himself sometimes offered. But this doesn't withstand scrutiny. British military record-keeping during World War II was extensive, and while certain intelligence operations were highly classified, the actual execution of physical deception, building dummy tanks, installing camouflage nets, constructing decoy facilities, involved large numbers of personnel and significant resources. Such activities left administrative trails. Moreover, after the war ended, much of the secrecy surrounding deception operations was lifted. Official histories were written, memoirs were published, and participants spoke openly about operations that had been closely guarded secrets during the war itself. The official history of British deception operations, written with full access to classified files, discusses Operation Bertram and other North African deceptions in detail. Jasper Maskelyne is not mentioned. Dudley Clarke, the actual architect of British deception in the Middle East, published his memoirs and discussed his operations. He named many officers who worked for him and with him. He discussed the camouflage work that supported his plans. He did not mention Maskelyne. Geoffrey Barkas, who commanded the actual Royal Engineers camouflage operation in North Africa during the key period, wrote about the work his units did. He described Operation Bertram, explained the techniques used, and credited the officers and men who executed the work. Maskelyne is mentioned only in passing as one officer among many. This pattern of absence is damning. If Maskelyne had truly been the central figure he claimed, his name would appear in these accounts. The most logical conclusion is that he was a relatively minor participant, competent at his technical work but not central to the major operations he later claimed to have designed and directed. There's another form of documentation that's relevant: German records. If Maskelyne's deceptions were as successful as claimed, there should be evidence in German intelligence reports and operational records that they were fooled in the ways he described. For some operations such as El Alamein, there is indeed evidence of successful deception. But the deception that succeeded was Operation Bertram as planned by a force, not Maskelyne's claimed personal operations. For other operations Maskelyne described, German records show no corresponding confusion. German bombers were not systematically fooled by a fake Alexandria harbor. They continued to attack the real harbor with about the same accuracy as they attacked other defended targets. German intelligence accurately identified British force dispositions in most cases. When they were deceived, it was generally due to the sophisticated, multi-channel deceptions run by a force, not physical camouflage alone. The pattern that emerges from examination of available documentation is clear. Maskelyne was a serving officer in Royal Engineers camouflage units in North Africa from 1941 to 1943. He and his colleagues did competent camouflage work, including construction of dummies and application of camouflage techniques. This work was part of larger deception operations planned and directed by specialized deception staff. Maskelyne's contribution was real but limited, technical rather than strategic, and not notably different from the work done by many other camouflage officers throughout the war. This is still honorable service, but it's not the story that Maskelyne would later tell the world. To understand Maskelyne's wartime experience and perhaps his later embellishments, it's worth considering what life was actually like for a British officer in North Africa during the desert campaigns. The Western Desert was a brutal environment. The days were scorching, with temperatures regularly exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The nights could be surprisingly cold. Sandstorms, called khamsin, would suddenly rise up, reducing visibility to near zero and coating everything and everyone with fine gritty dust that penetrated every seal and crevice. Water was perpetually scarce, strictly rationed, and often brackish. Food was monotonous: bully beef, hard biscuits, tea. Dysentery and desert sores were endemic. Living conditions were primitive. Officers like Maskelyne would have been bivouacked in tents, moving periodically as operations dictated. There was little entertainment, little contact with home, and long stretches of tedium punctuated by moments of danger when German aircraft appeared overhead or artillery fire fell nearby. For a man who had spent his life in the theaters of London, accustomed to comfort and civilization, this must have been profoundly disorienting. The glamour of going to war would have quickly worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of heat, dust, boredom, and discomfort. At the same time, there was the undeniable excitement of being part of a great enterprise. The war in North Africa captured public imagination in Britain. Rommel was a figure of respect even among his enemies, a brilliant commander, honorable according to the standards of the time, and a worthy adversary. To be fighting Rommel in the desert had a quality of almost chivalric adventure, very different from the anonymous industrial slaughter on the Eastern Front or the moral complexities of the bombing campaign. For an officer with technical skills rather than command responsibilities, much of the time would have been spent on routine work. Supervising construction crews building dummies or installing camouflage nets. Conducting training on camouflage techniques. Inspecting installations to assess their effectiveness. Attending briefings and writing reports. The daily routine of military administration and technical oversight, not dramatic but necessary. There would have been moments of real danger. German and Italian aircraft conducted regular reconnaissance and bombing missions. Being in or near military installations meant being a potential target. Several times during his service, Maskelyne was reportedly close to bomb impacts or strafing runs. These experiences, terrifying when they occurred, were shared by hundreds of thousands of servicemen in the theater. There would also have been moments of genuine accomplishment. seeing a camouflaged position remain undetected during enemy reconnaissance. Hearing that a dummy installation had been bombed, meaning real equipment elsewhere was spared. Successfully installing a deception element that contributed to an operation's success. These satisfactions, while perhaps modest compared to the glory of leading troops into battle, were real and meaningful. For a man like Maskelyne, ambitious and conscious of his family reputation, this combination of genuine service and moderate accomplishment must have been simultaneously satisfying and frustrating. He was contributing to the war effort, doing work that mattered. But he was not the hero of his own story, not the way his grandfather had been the hero of the magic world. He was one among many, doing valuable but not exceptional work. This context helps explain what came later. The war years gave Maskelyne real experiences and real accomplishments. But they also gave him time to imagine, to envision what his story could be, to transform modest contributions into grand achievements in his own mind. The line between what he actually did and what he came to believe he did may have blurred gradually, over countless nights in the desert, as he rehearsed and refined the narrative that would become his legacy. By early 1943, the North African campaign was entering its final phase. Montgomery's 8th Army had driven Rommel out of Egypt and across Libya. Anglo-American forces had landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch and were pushing eastward. The Afrika Korps was caught in a vice, retreating into Tunisia with dwindling supplies and no realistic hope of victory. For those involved in deception and camouflage work, this changing strategic situation meant evolving tasks. As British forces advanced, new facilities needed camouflage. As the front moved west, deception operations shifted to support new offensive operations and to cover the massive buildup for the next phase of the war, the invasion of Sicily and Italy. Maskelyne's specific activities during this period are poorly documented, which itself suggests he was engaged in routine duties rather than dramatic special operations. He would likely have moved with his unit, continuing camouflage work as the theater shifted. There may have been continued construction of dummy installations, continued training of personnel, continued application of standard camouflage techniques. The Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943, ending the North African campaign with complete Allied victory. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers became prisoners of war. The Mediterranean was secured as an Allied waterway, and planning accelerated for the invasion of mainland Europe. For Maskelyne personally, the end of the North African campaign brought a transition. According to various accounts, he was posted away from frontline camouflage duty sometime in 1943. Some sources suggest he was sent back to England. Others indicate he may have been involved in planning or training for later operations. The details are unclear, which again suggests his role was not particularly notable. Senior officers and key personnel have well-documented movements and assignments. Junior officers often disappear into administrative gaps. What is clear is that Maskelyne's most active and direct involvement in combat theater deception ended with the North African campaign. Whether he participated in any significant way in preparations for the invasion of Italy or, later, the invasion of France is uncertain. He does not appear prominently in the extensive documentation of Operation Fortitude, the deception plan supporting D-Day, nor in other European theater deception operations. By the war's end in 1945, Major Jasper Maskelyne had served for approximately 5 years in the British Army, with roughly 2 years spent in the North African theater. He had experienced combat conditions, contributed to the war effort, and earned his discharge with the respect due to any officer who had served honorably. It was a creditable military career, neither more nor less distinguished than thousands of others. But for Maskelyne this was not enough. The Maskelyne name demanded something more. Something extraordinary, something that would make his wartime service not just honorable but legendary. The transformation of Jasper Maskelyne from a competent camouflage officer into a legendary war magician began almost immediately after the war ended. In 1946, newspaper articles started appearing in the British press with dramatic accounts of Maskelyne's wartime exploits. These articles, likely placed by Maskelyne himself or by a publicist working on his behalf, featured sensational claims about his operations. One article described how he had made the Suez Canal disappear. Another claimed he had created an entire false harbor at Alexandria that fooled German bombers. A third stated that his deceptions at El Alamein had been crucial to Montgomery's victory. The stories were dramatic, patriotic, and impossible to verify. The details were classified, naturally, and the operations had been so secret that even now, official sources could neither confirm nor deny them. The British public, war-weary but hungry for stories of British ingenuity and triumph, embraced these tales enthusiastically. Here was a narrative that combined multiple appealing elements: a clever British gentleman outsmarting the Germans, the application of uniquely British eccentricity, a stage magician in the military, and a suggestion that the war had been won not just through industrial might but through cleverness and guile. It was exactly the kind of story that post-war Britain wanted to hear. In 1949, Maskelyne published his memoir, Magic, Top Secret. The book, ghostwritten by Frank S. Stewart, was an immediate success. It presented a first-person account of Maskelyne's wartime operations, written in a breezy, entertaining style that made the war seem like a grand adventure. The book contained detailed descriptions of operations including the hiding of Alexandria Harbor, the disguising of the Suez Canal, the creation of phantom armies, and his central role in the El Alamein deception. Magic, Top Secret, was presented as non-fiction as Maskelyne's true wartime story. But the book contained numerous elements that should have raised skepticism. The operations described were so dramatic and successful that they would have been war-winning in themselves. Maskelyne was portrayed as operating with remarkable independence, taking initiatives and making decisions that in reality would have required approval at very high levels. Enemy forces were consistently fooled completely, with every deception working exactly as planned, a level of success that was implausible given the competence of German intelligence and the difficulty of deception operations. Moreover, the book contained specific technical and military details that were questionable or wrong. Maskelyne described operations involving equipment or techniques that didn't exist or weren't available at the times claimed. He placed himself at locations when records show he was elsewhere. He claimed credit for operations that other sources attributed to different units or individuals. Some reviewers and readers did notice these issues. Military professionals reading the book recognized that it didn't align with their understanding of how military operations actually worked. Former intelligence officers saw inconsistencies with known deception procedures. But in the immediate post-war years, there was neither the access to official records nor the organized effort required to systematically fact-check Maskelyne's claims. The book was translated into multiple languages and sold widely. It was excerpted in magazines and newspapers. Maskelyne became a celebrity, invited to speak at events and to appear on radio programs. He was exactly what his grandfather had been, a famous magician, but now famous for military magic rather than stage magic. The Maskelyne name was once again prominent, and Jasper had finally stepped out of his grandfather's shadow by creating his own legend. Over subsequent years, Maskelyne would continue to tell and embellish his story. Each retelling added new details, made the operations more dramatic, made his role more central. In some versions he claimed to have worked directly with Montgomery or Churchill. In others, he suggested that his techniques had been adopted across the entire Allied military. The story grew in the telling as stories do, until it bore little resemblance to the modest reality of routine camouflage work. The question of whether Maskelyne consciously knew he was exaggerating or whether he had come to believe his own mythology is impossible to answer with certainty. Memory is malleable, especially regarding events that occurred years earlier and have been retold many times. It's possible that Maskelyne started with a core of genuine experiences, embellished them for dramatic effect, and over time came to remember the embellished version as the truth. It's also possible that he deliberately fabricated much of his story for publicity and profit. Most likely, the truth involved elements of both, some conscious embellishment combined with self-deception and the natural human tendency to remember ourselves as more central and more successful than we actually were. For decades after the war, Maskelyne's story was largely accepted at face value by the general public. His book remained in print. Documentaries and articles referenced his wartime exploits without skepticism. He had created a compelling narrative, and in the absence of contradictory evidence, it became accepted fact. However, serious military historians began to have doubts. As official archives were opened and detailed histories of the war were written, Maskelyne's name was conspicuously absent from the documented record of deception operations. Historians writing comprehensive accounts of Operation Bertram, A Force, and other North African deceptions made no mention of Maskelyne's supposed contributions. The first serious challenge came from Richard Stokes in the 1970s, when he was researching the history of British deception operations. With access to recently declassified files, Stokes found extensive documentation of how deception operations were actually planned and executed, and Maskelyne wasn't in any of it. When Stokes published his findings, he concluded that most of Maskelyne's claims were either greatly exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Subsequent historians conducting deeper research reached similar conclusions. David Fisher, investigating the specific claims about Alexandria Harbor and the Suez Canal, found no supporting evidence in British or German archives. The operations Maskelyne described, if they had occurred as claimed, would have left extensive paper trails and would have been mentioned in German intelligence assessments, but they weren't. Perhaps the most comprehensive debunking came from military historian Nicholas Rankin, whose book Churchill's Wizards, The British Genius for Deception 1914 to 1945, examined British deception operations across both world wars. With access to extensive archival materials and interviews with surviving participants, Rankin systematically examined Maskelyne's claims. His conclusion was unequivocal. While Maskelyne had served in camouflage units and done competent technical work, he had not been a key figure in any major deception operation and had not invented or directed the operations he claimed. Rankin and others discovered that the real architects of deception in North Africa were officers like Dudley Clarke, who designed sophisticated, multi-layered deception plans, and Geoffrey Barkis, who commanded the camouflage units that built the physical elements of those plans. Maskelyne had been one officer among many in Barkis's organization, working competently but without special distinction. The scholarly consensus that emerged was damaging to Maskelyne's legend. Academic historians and serious military history publications began to describe him as a fabulist, a man who had taken legitimate but modest service and transformed it through exaggeration and invention into a fictional hero's tale. His memoir was reclassified, in effect, from nonfiction to a kind of historical fantasy, entertaining but unreliable. This historical revisionism faced resistance from the general public and from those who had emotional investment in the Maskelyne story. After all, it was a wonderful tale. The idea of a stage magician using his skills to fool the Nazis was inherently appealing, combining cleverness, patriotism, and a touch of whimsy. Many people preferred the exciting legend to the mundane truth. Moreover, some defenders argued that the absence of documentation didn't necessarily prove absence, especially for classified operations. Perhaps Maskelyne's work had been so secret that documentation was destroyed or remained classified beyond normal declassification schedules. Perhaps his operations were deniable by design, conducted without normal paper trails. These arguments, while theoretically possible, became increasingly implausible as more and more wartime records were released. By the early 21st century, virtually all documents relating to World War II deception operations had been declassified. The full files of a force, the detailed planning documents for Operation Bertram, the complete archives of the Camouflage Directorate, all became available to researchers. If Maskelyne had played the role he claimed, evidence would have appeared. It did not. The most telling evidence came from those who had actually worked in North African deception operations. When historians located and interviewed surviving veterans of a force and Royal Engineers camouflage units, they consistently reported that Maskelyne had been a minor figure, competent but not exceptional. Some remembered him as a bit of a self-promoter even during the war. None recalled him as the mastermind of major operations. Geoffrey Barkis, in his own book, The Camouflage Story, published in 1952, described the work of his camouflage units in detail. He mentioned many officers by name, gave credit to various individuals for specific innovations and contributions, and provided a comprehensive account of how Operations Bertram and other deceptions were executed. Maskelyne appeared in this account as one officer among many, responsible for some routine construction work. A passing mention in a comprehensive history, which is exactly what one would expect for a minor participant. The scholarly verdict was clear. Jasper Maskelyne had embellished his war service beyond recognition, creating a largely fictional account of his contributions. This did not mean he had been a fraud in the sense of not serving. He had genuinely been in the military, had genuinely worked in camouflage, and had genuinely been in North Africa. But his memoir was fundamentally unreliable as a historical source, and the popular image of Maskelyne as a war-changing magician was a myth. Understanding how Maskelyne's exaggerations developed requires examining the specific mechanisms by which modest truths were transformed into dramatic legends. In several cases, historians have been able to trace the likely origins of Maskelyne's claims and see how real events were inflated. Take the Alexandria Harbor story. There were genuine defensive deception measures around Alexandria, implemented by standard camouflage units. These included some dummy installations in outlying areas, intended to draw occasional bombing raids away from critical facilities. There were also lighting restrictions and blackout procedures designed to reduce the visibility of the harbor from the air. These were routine protective measures, competently executed but not extraordinary. Maskelyne, working in camouflage in Egypt during this period, would have been aware of these measures and may have participated in some of them. In recounting his service after the war, he could truthfully say he worked on deception operations around Alexandria. But through successive retellings, worked on defensive camouflage measures around Alexandria, created a false harbor that fooled German bombers, and eventually made Alexandria harbor disappear while creating an entire fake harbor miles away. Each step of embellishment added drama while maintaining a tenuous connection to underlying reality. This is a common pattern in the inflation of personal war stories, starting from a kernel of truth and progressively adding details that make the storyteller more central, more heroic, and more successful. The Suez Canal story likely followed a similar trajectory. There were defensive measures along the canal, including anti-aircraft batteries, searchlight units, and camouflage of specific facilities. Maskelyne may have been involved in some aspect of this work, but contributed to defensive camouflage along sections of the canal, designed and implemented a revolutionary system of lights and mirrors that hid the entire canal from German bombers. The El Alamein deception is perhaps the most revealing case because we have extensive documentation of what actually happened. Operation Bertram was real, it was successful, and it involved extensive construction of dummy installations and camouflage of real forces. Maskelyne was present in North Africa during this period and worked in camouflage, so he certainly would have been aware of the operation and may have participated in some of its physical implementation. But awareness and participation are very different from design and direction. The evidence shows that Operation Bertram was planned by a force under Dudley Clark and executed by multiple Royal Engineers units under Geoffrey Barkas's overall command. Maskelyne's unit may have built some dummy tanks or installed some camouflage, routine work that dozens of similar units were doing across the front. But helped build some of the dummy tanks used at El Alamein, designed and directed the deception operation that won the Battle of El Alamein. This pattern, taking genuine but modest participation and transforming it into central, directing authority, appears repeatedly in Maskelyne's accounts. He was present at historical events, which gave his stories verisimilitude, but he inflated his role beyond recognition. Another mechanism of exaggeration involved appropriating the accomplishments of others. The British deception apparatus in North Africa achieved genuine successes through sophisticated, multi-layered operations. These operations involved coordination across intelligence, signals, logistics, and physical deception. By focusing on the physical deception elements, the part he actually had some connection to, and ignoring or minimizing the other crucial elements, Maskelyne could present himself as the author of successes that were actually collective achievements involving dozens or hundreds of people. There's also the matter of theatrical dramatization. Maskelyne was, after all, a professional entertainer. He knew how to tell a story, how to build suspense, how to create drama. His accounts of military operations read like adventure novels, exciting, fast-paced, with clear heroes and villains, dramatic reversals, and triumphant conclusions. Real military operations are messier, more bureaucratic, more ambiguous. By applying theatrical narrative techniques to genuine events, Maskelyne created compelling stories that bore little resemblance to the mundane reality. Finally, there's the question of audience. Maskelyne told his stories primarily to civilians who had no direct knowledge of military operations and no way to verify his claims. The complexity of actual military deception, the coordination requirements, the approval chains, the integration with intelligence, was invisible to civilian audiences. They had no framework for recognizing that Maskelyne's accounts described operations that would have been impossible for a captain or major to direct independently. The stories sounded plausible because the audience lacked the expertise to recognize their implausibility. While the scholarly consensus has been highly critical of Maskelyne's claims, some defenders have argued for a more nuanced assessment. These arguments deserve consideration, even if they ultimately don't rehabilitate Maskelyne's most dramatic claims. One argument is that Maskelyne's theatrical expertise did provide genuine value that may not be fully captured in official records. Military documentation focuses on outcomes and resources, not on subtle contributions of perspective and approach. Perhaps Maskelyne's insights into visual perception and illusion did enhance the effectiveness of camouflage work in ways that were real but difficult to document. There's some validity to this argument. Camouflage and deception are as much art as science, and someone with deep understanding of how audiences perceive visual information could potentially improve the design and execution of deceptions. However, this would still represent professional competence rather than revolutionary contribution, and it doesn't justify the specific operational claims Maskelyne made. A second argument is that wartime secrecy may have genuinely limited documentation. Perhaps some of Maskelyne's work was conducted under such tight security that normal records were not created or were subsequently destroyed. In intelligence work, need-to-know restrictions sometimes meant that even significant operations were known only to a few people. However, this argument fails when applied to the specific operations Maskelyne described. Operations Bertram was extensively documented because it was a major planned deception supporting a major offensive. Such operations required documentation for coordination and assessment. If Maskelyne had been central to Bertram's planning or execution, he would appear in these documents. Physical construction of dummy installations involved hundreds of men and substantial resources. This could not be conducted without administrative records. The pattern of documentation absence is too consistent to be explained by secrecy alone. A third argument is that collective memory and official histories sometimes minimize individual contributions, particularly from junior officers. Perhaps Maskelyne's genuine innovations were absorbed into standard practice without proper attribution, or his contributions were credited to his commanding officers in official reports. This phenomenon does occur in military history. Junior officers often don't receive individual credit for their work. However, when historians examine the innovations that were developed in North African camouflage work, they can generally trace them to specific individuals or groups, and Maskelyne is not among them. The sunshield tank disguises, for instance, were developed by camouflage specialists before Maskelyne arrived in theater. The sophisticated deception planning methodologies were developed by Clark and his staff. When specific innovations can be traced, they don't lead to Maskelyne. A fourth argument, more sympathetic to Maskelyne, is that his exaggerations were a kind of performance, an extension of his magician's persona rather than a deliberate fraud. From this perspective, Maskelyne was telling stories the way a magician performs illusions. The audience understands at some level that what they're seeing isn't literally true, but they suspend disbelief for the sake of entertainment. Perhaps Maskelyne never intended his accounts to be taken as literal historical truth, but rather as entertaining narratives inspired by real events. This is a generous interpretation, and there may be some psychological truth to it. However, it's undermined by the fact that Maskelyne explicitly presented his accounts as non-fiction, as true histories of real operations. He didn't market his memoir as inspired by true events, but as his actual war service. He accepted praise and recognition based on the assumption that his accounts were factual. If it was performance, he maintained the performance so consistently that he accepted credit he knew he hadn't earned, which returns us to questions of honesty and integrity. Perhaps the most compelling defense is simply that Maskelyne was human, with human weaknesses and human needs. He was a man who lived in the shadow of a famous grandfather, who had achieved only moderate success in his chosen career, who went to war hoping to prove himself and found only routine service. The exaggerations may have begun as small embellishments to make good stories at dinner parties and grown over time as he found audiences receptive to more dramatic tales. Memory is reconstructive. Perhaps he came to believe his own mythology, remembering himself as he wished he had been rather than as he was. This defense doesn't excuse the fabrications, but it makes them humanly comprehensible. Maskelyne was not unique in exaggerating his war service. Many veterans have inflated their roles in famous events or claim to have been present at battles they watched from a distance. The difference is mainly one of scale and success. Maskelyne's exaggerations were believed by millions and shaped public understanding of wartime deception for decades. One element of the Maskelyne legend deserves particular attention: the Magic Gang itself. This was the term Maskelyne used to describe his supposed team of theatrical specialists who executed his deception operations. The Magic Gang has become iconic, mentioned in documentaries, books, and articles as an established historical fact. But what was the reality? According to Maskelyne's accounts, he personally recruited approximately a dozen men with specialized skills from the entertainment and artistic worlds. The roster supposedly included a stage carpenter, a scenic designer, an electrical engineer who had worked on theater lighting, a chemist who understood special effects materials, a cartoonist for creating visual deceptions, and others. Together, they formed an elite, semi-independent unit operating under Maskelyne's direction, taking on special deception missions that required their unique combination of skills. The reality appears to have been considerably more prosaic. Royal Engineers camouflage units throughout the British Army included personnel with diverse backgrounds. The nature of camouflage work, construction of dummy installations, application of paint and netting, design of visual deceptions, naturally attracted individuals with artistic or technical skills. Art school graduates, commercial artists, scenic designers and craftsmen were actively recruited into camouflage work because their skills were directly applicable. This was true across the entire camouflage branch, not unique to any unit Maskelyne was part of. Geoffrey Barkas's camouflage organization in North Africa included numerous officers and men with artistic backgrounds. Stephen Sykes, a well-known painter, served as a camouflage officer. Robert Medley, another artist, worked in deception planning. Theater professionals, craftsmen and artists were scattered throughout the camouflage apparatus. So when Maskelyne described assembling a team of theatrical specialists, he was probably describing what was actually a routine Royal Engineers camouflage section. A normal military unit that happened to include people with useful civilian skills, just like every other camouflage section. The Magic Gang was likely a theatrical name Maskelyne applied to his normal military unit, making routine duty sound like a special elite force. Some specific individuals have been identified as having worked with Maskelyne. Philip Townsend appears in several sources as someone who knew Maskelyne during the war and remained friendly afterward. Townsend did have some theatrical background and did work in camouflage. But after the war, Townsend never corroborated the dramatic operations Maskelyne described. A significant silence given that he would have been in a position to confirm the stories if they were true. Other members of the supposed Magic Gang are harder to identify. Maskelyne's accounts sometimes provided first names only or used nicknames. Attempts by historians to match these references to actual personnel records have been largely unsuccessful. This could mean the individuals were real but have been difficult to trace, or it could mean Maskelyne fictionalized or heavily embellished the characters in his stories. What seems clear is that there was no official Magic Gang unit with special status or independent operational authority. There is no record of such a unit in Royal Engineers documentation. There are no orders creating it, no establishment tables defining its personnel and equipment, no reports from it in the chain of command. If Maskelyne's camouflage section informally called themselves the Magic Gang as a nickname, which is entirely plausible and would be typical of military humor, that would be very different from being an officially recognized elite unit. The Magic Gang story is emblematic of how Maskelyne's legend was constructed. Take a probable kernel of truth. Maskelyne worked in a camouflage unit with some talented people, and embellish it into something dramatic. A hand-picked elite team of theatrical wizards operating semi-independently on special missions. The embellished version is more exciting, more memorable, and makes Maskelyne more important. But it's not history, it's mythology. To fully appreciate what Maskelyne claimed versus what was actually accomplished, it's essential to understand the remarkable sophistication of actual British deception operations during World War II. The real story of British wartime deception is actually more impressive than Maskelyne's fabrications, though less centered on any single individual. The London Controlling Section, established in 1941, coordinated strategic deception across all theaters. Under officers like Colonel John Bevan, this small staff developed sophisticated deception strategies integrated with overall Allied plans. They understood that effective deception required coordination across multiple channels: physical, dummy installations, signals, false radio traffic, intelligence, double agents and planted documents, and diplomatic, allowing certain information to be discovered through neutral channels. In the Middle East, Dudley Clark's A-Force pioneered many deception techniques that would later be used in Europe. Clark understood that the goal was not to fool the enemy about one thing but to build an entire false picture of Allied intentions and capabilities. This required long-term planning, careful coordination, and understanding of how enemy intelligence worked. The most famous deception of the war, Operation Fortitude, supporting the D-Day invasion, exemplified this sophisticated approach. Fortitude created an entire fictional army group, Fusag, supposedly preparing to invade the Pas-de-Calais, while the real invasion force prepared to hit Normandy. This deception involved physical elements: dummy landing craft, inflatable tanks, false buildings and camps visible to aerial reconnaissance. Signals deception: extensive false radio traffic simulating a large army group. Intelligence deception: double agents reporting to German intelligence about the fake army. Command deception: placing General Patton, whom Germans respected, in command of the Phantom Army. Administrative deception: creating supply requisitions, movement orders, and other documentation for units that didn't exist. This deception succeeded brilliantly. German intelligence believed in Fusag and its Pas-de-Calais invasion plan. Even after the Normandy landings began, Hitler held substantial forces in the Calais region because he believed Normandy was a feint and the main invasion was still coming. This deception saved thousands of Allied lives and contributed significantly to the success of D-Day. Operation Fortitude was the work of hundreds of people across multiple organizations, coordinated by high-level staffs, and integrated with the overall invasion plan. The physical dummies and dummy camps, the elements most similar to what Maskelyne claimed to have created, were actually the least important part. They were necessary to provide visual confirmation for what enemy intelligence was learning through other channels, but alone they would not have been convincing. This is the critical point. Successful large-scale deception in World War II required sophisticated coordination across multiple deception channels. Physical camouflage and dummy installations were supporting elements in larger strategies, not standalone war-winning tricks. A dummy tank by itself might fool an individual pilot. 1,000 dummy tanks might concern enemy intelligence. But creating a false picture that changed enemy strategic decisions required much more. Signals, traffic, agent reports, administrative evidence, diplomatic intelligence, all carefully synchronized. Maskelyne's claimed operations, making harbors disappear, hiding the Suez Canal, creating phantom armies, were described as standalone physical deceptions that achieved strategic effects. This reveals their fictional nature. Real strategic deception didn't work that way. If Maskelyne had actually been central to strategic deception in North Africa, he would have been part of a force or working in close coordination with them, and his operations would have been integrated into multi-channel deception plans. There's no evidence this was the case. The actual heroes of British deception, Clark, Bevan, their staffs, the double agents of the double-cross system, the signals specialists, the intelligence analysts, conducted genuinely remarkable operations that changed the course of the war. But their work was collective, coordinated, and sophisticated. It doesn't fit the narrative of a single genius magician outsmarting the enemy through clever tricks, which is probably why Maskelyne's simpler, more individualistic story was more appealing to popular imagination. After the war ended in 1945, Jasper Maskelyne was discharged from the army with the rank of major. He was 43 years old, returning to a Britain that was victorious but exhausted and economically devastated. The theaters and entertainment world he had known before the war had changed. Rationing continued, entertainment was still constrained, and audiences were different, shaped by years of war. Maskelyne attempted to rebuild his magic career. He performed at various venues, trading on both the Maskelyne name and increasingly on his war record. His performances now often included references to his military service, suggesting that audiences were watching not just a magician but a war hero who had used magic to defeat the Nazis. This narrative made him more marketable and helped distinguish him from other magicians competing for audience attention. However, the British entertainment industry was struggling. The rise of cinema continued to draw audiences away from live theatrical performances. Television, though still in its infancy in the late 1940s, represented another competitive threat. The market for stage magic was shrinking, and even with the added appeal of his war record, Maskelyne found success elusive. It was in this context that he wrote Magic, Top Secret, published in 1949. The book was a success, selling well and generating significant publicity. For a time, Maskelyne was more famous as an author and war personality than as a performing magician. He gave lectures about his wartime experiences, appeared on radio programs, and enjoyed a level of recognition he had never achieved through stage performance alone. The financial success of the book and associated publicity helped stabilize his situation, but it also locked him into the narrative he had created. Having published his wartime claims and accepted recognition based on them, Maskelyne could not easily retreat from the stories without admitting he had exaggerated or fabricated. The legend he had created became something he had to maintain. In the early 1950s, Maskelyne made a significant change. He emigrated to Kenya, then still a British colony. The reasons for this move are not entirely clear from available records. Some sources suggest he was seeking new opportunities in a less crowded entertainment market. Others hint at personal or financial difficulties in Britain. It's possible he also wanted some distance from people who had actually been involved in North African operations and might contradict his accounts. In Kenya, Maskelyne established himself as a performer and entertainer. He performed magic shows, gave lectures, and was apparently involved in various business ventures. He became a recognizable figure in Nairobi's expatriate community. By most accounts, he lived comfortably if not luxuriously, supported by his performances and the continuing royalties from his book. He remained in Kenya for the rest of his life, though he occasionally returned to Britain for visits. He continued to perform and continued to tell his war stories, which were increasingly embellished with each retelling. To audiences in Kenya who were even further removed from the actual events than British audiences, his tales must have seemed exotic and impressive. Maskelyne's personal life during these years is documented more sparsely than his earlier life. His marriage to Evelyn had apparently ended in divorce at some point during or shortly after the war, a casualty of the long separations and changed circumstances like many wartime marriages. His relationship with his son Alistair was reportedly strained, though details are limited. In Kenya, Maskelyne lived somewhat apart from the communities that might have challenged his narratives. In Britain, he might encounter military veterans who had actually worked in North African deception and would know his stories were exaggerated. In Kenya's expatriate community, he was largely accepted at his own valuation, a war hero who had used magic to help defeat the Nazis. He performed magic almost until the end. Even in his 60s and 70s, Maskelyne would give shows for private parties, charity events, and occasionally larger venues. He was, by all accounts, a competent professional performer, not brilliant perhaps, but skilled and entertaining. The magic was real even if the war stories were not. Jasper Maskelyne died in Kenya on March 19, 1973, at the age of 70. He had lived long enough to see his legend become firmly established in popular culture but not long enough to see it seriously challenged by historical scholarship. His obituaries, published in various British papers, repeated his wartime claims largely without question, describing him as the magician who had deceived Rommel and helped win the North African campaign. Despite, or perhaps because of, the dubious historical accuracy of Maskelyne's accounts, his legend has had remarkable staying power in popular culture. The story of the war magician proved to be irresistible to storytellers across multiple media. Documentaries about World War II deception have frequently featured segments on Maskelyne, usually presenting his claims with minimal skepticism. The visual appeal of the story, magic tricks applied to warfare, dummy tanks and false harbors, clever British ingenuity outsmarting German military might, makes for compelling television. Producers have often prioritized narrative appeal over historical accuracy, and Maskelyne's story delivers narrative appeal in abundance. Books about World War II, particularly those aimed at popular audiences rather than academic historians, have often included chapters on Maskelyne. He appears in books about deception, books about unusual military operations, and books about eccentric characters of the war. The pattern is usually the same. His claims are presented largely at face value, perhaps with a brief acknowledgement that some details are disputed, but without serious investigation of their veracity. The story has inspired fiction as well. Several novels have featured characters based on Maskelyne or plots involving magicians using their skills in wartime. These fictionalized accounts, while not claiming to be history, have further reinforced the basic legend in public imagination. When the historical figure and the fictional versions blur together, distinguishing fact from fiction becomes even more difficult. There have been multiple attempts to develop film projects about Maskelyne. His story seems perfect for cinema: visual spectacle, wartime adventure, an unconventional hero, clear villains, and a satisfying victory. Various screenplays have been written, directors have been attached to projects, and actors have been considered for the role. As of 2025, several film projects have been announced over the years, though none has reached production, perhaps in part due to the historical controversies surrounding the story. The persistence of Maskelyne's legend in popular culture despite scholarly debunking reveals something about how historical narratives function. Popular memory often prefers compelling stories to complex truths. The real story of British deception, sophisticated, multi-layered, collective, bureaucratic, is less cinematically appealing than the story of a lone genius magician. The reality involves coordination meetings, administrative oversight, signals intelligence, and careful integration with military operations. Maskelyne's version involves a charismatic individual performing impossible feats. Audiences naturally prefer the latter. Moreover, the Maskelyne legend appeals to particular cultural narratives about the war. For British audiences, it reinforces the idea of British cleverness and ingenuity compensating for inferior resources, the notion that Britain won through brains rather than just industrial might. The gentleman amateur outwitting the professional German military plays into long-standing British cultural tropes. Maskelyne as a figure represents a comforting version of the war, exciting but not truly terrifying, won through cleverness rather than mass slaughter. There's also an element of wish fulfillment. The idea that magic, illusion, creativity, theatrical thinking, could meaningfully contribute to defeating evil is appealing. It suggests that diverse skills and unconventional thinking have value even in the harsh reality of war. It makes warfare seem less purely about violence and destruction and more about human ingenuity and cleverness. This is a comforting myth, even if it's not accurate. The Maskelyne legend has also been embraced by some in the magic community, who appreciate the idea that a magician contributed significantly to winning the war. It elevates the profession, suggesting that the skills magicians develop have applications beyond entertainment. While many professional magicians are aware of the historical controversies, the popular version of Maskelyne's story remains appealing as a representation of what magicians like to believe about their craft. In recent years, as more people have become aware of the historical controversies surrounding Maskelyne's claims, a more nuanced conversation has emerged about how to understand and present his story. Some historians have argued for essentially dismissing Maskelyne's accounts entirely as unreliable fabrications with minimal historical value. From this perspective, his memoir and subsequent retellings are interesting primarily as examples of how war myths are created and propagated, but they contain too little verifiable truth to be useful as sources for understanding actual deception operations. Others advocate for a more balanced approach, acknowledging that Maskelyne served in camouflage units, did real work that contributed marginally to deception operations, but greatly exaggerated his role and importance. This perspective tries to give Maskelyne credit for what he actually did, competent technical work in a supporting role, while firmly rejecting the dramatic claims of central importance. A third perspective, less common but worth considering, suggests that focusing too much on debunking Maskelyne may miss some valuable insights. Even if his specific operational claims were false, his discussion of how illusion principles could apply to military deception may have contained useful ideas. His theoretical contributions, the application of magicians' thinking to camouflage problems, might have had value even if his practical contributions were modest. There's also been discussion about the ethics of appropriating others' work. To the extent that successful deception operations did occur in North Africa, and they did, particularly Operation Bertram, Maskelyne's false claims have the effect of stealing credit from those who actually planned and executed these operations. Dudley Clark, Geoffrey Barkis, and the many officers and enlisted men who did the actual work have been somewhat overshadowed in popular memory by Maskelyne's fabrications. There's an injustice in this that some historians feel compelled to address by setting the record straight. On the other hand, some argue that there's limited value in continuing to debunk a myth that's largely been discredited in scholarly circles. Those interested in serious military history already know that Maskelyne's claims are unreliable. Popular culture may continue to perpetuate the legend, but popular culture has never been a reliable source for historical accuracy about any topic. Perhaps the scholarly effort is better spent telling the true stories of deception operations rather than repeatedly debunking false ones. The question of how to present Maskelyne's story in educational contexts, museums, documentaries, history courses, remains contentious. Should exhibits about wartime deception mention Maskelyne at all? If they do mention him, should it be as an example of historical mythology rather than actual history? How much time should be devoted to explaining why his claims are false versus simply ignoring them and focusing on what actually happened? Some institutions have chosen to include Maskelyne as a case study in how historical myths develop. Museum exhibits about World War II deception sometimes include sections that discuss Maskelyne, present his claims, and then explain the historical evidence that contradicts them. This approach uses Maskelyne's story as a teaching tool about historical methodology and critical thinking. Valuable lessons even if the specific content is about debunking false claims. The Imperial War Museum in London, for instance, has addressed Maskelyne in its exhibits about deception warfare. Rather than simply presenting his claims, the museum provides context about what deception operations actually involved and notes that while Maskelyne served in camouflage, his role was far more limited than he claimed. This balanced approach acknowledges popular interest in the Maskelyne story while maintaining historical accuracy. Academic historians writing about British deception operations now typically mention Maskelyne only briefly, if at all, usually in a footnote explaining that his popular accounts are unreliable. The focus has shifted to the real architects and executors of deception: Clark, Bevan, Barkis, and the organizational structures they worked within. This scholarly focus on what actually happened rather than on debunking false claims represents a mature phase of historical understanding. Ironically, while Maskelyne's fabricated stories have overshadowed the truth in popular culture, the real history of wartime deception is actually more fascinating and impressive than his legends. The sophisticated operations conducted by the London Controlling Section, a force, and other deception organizations represent genuine strategic brilliance. Consider Operation Mincemeat, the famous deception where a corpse carrying false invasion plans was floated off the Spanish coast to mislead Germans about the Allied invasion of Sicily. This operation required coordination across military intelligence, medical facilities, legal authorities, and operational commands. The body was given a complete false identity, including personal letters and documents that would pass scrutiny. The operational plans it carried were sophisticated enough to seem genuine but designed to lead Germans to false conclusions. Spanish officials were correctly predicted to provide information to German intelligence. The operation succeeded brilliantly, contributing to the success of the Sicily invasion by drawing German forces away from the actual landing sites. Or consider the double-cross system, where British intelligence turned virtually every German agent in Britain and used them to feed false information back to German intelligence. The XX Committee, which ran these operations, conducted this massive deception continuously throughout the war, carefully managing what information each double agent provided to build a consistent but false picture of British capabilities and intentions. The sophistication required to maintain this deception across dozens of agents over years, ensuring all the information was mutually consistent and supported overall strategic deception goals, was extraordinary. The creation of notional military units, fake divisions, corps, and armies that existed only on paper and in enemy intelligence assessments, required building elaborate supporting evidence. A notional division needed a full order of battle, appropriate signals traffic, supply requisitions, barracks and training facilities visible to reconnaissance, shoulder patches for uniforms, routine administrative traffic, and movement patterns consistent with training and preparation. Creating this false infrastructure across multiple domains was a massive undertaking requiring careful coordination. The strategic payoff of these deceptions was real and measurable. Operation Fortitude kept German forces away from Normandy beaches during the critical early days of the D-Day invasion. Operation Bodyguard, the overarching deception plan for the European invasion, kept Germans confused about Allied intentions across multiple theaters. In North Africa, Operation Bertram contributed to the success at El Alamein by achieving tactical and operational surprise. These real operations were collective achievements, requiring contributions from hundreds of people across multiple organizations. They represented not individual genius but organizational sophistication, the ability to coordinate complex activities across multiple domains toward strategic goals. They were bureaucratic achievements as much as intellectual ones, requiring not just clever ideas but disciplined execution and careful management. This is perhaps less romantically appealing than the story of a lone magician working miracles, but it's more impressive. The British developed systematic approaches to deception, organizational structures that could plan and execute complex operations, and methods for integrating deception with military operations. They professionalized and systematized what had previously been ad hoc and opportunistic. This represented genuine innovation in warfare. The officers who led these efforts, Clark, Bevan, and others, deserve recognition for real achievement. They understood that modern warfare's complexity created opportunities for deception at scale. They recognized that multiple intelligence channels could be coordinated to build false pictures in enemy minds. They pioneered methods that became foundational to modern military deception doctrine. The thousands of people who executed these operations, building physical decoys, transmitting false radio messages, managing double agents, writing administrative documents, coordinating across organizations, also deserve credit. Their collective work changed the course of battles and saved lives. This work was often tedious and always had to be performed with meticulous attention to detail, because one mistake could unravel an entire deception. The discipline and professionalism required was considerable. Against this background of real achievement, Maskelyne's fabrications seem almost trivial, a stage magician inflating his modest contributions into tall tales. The real magic was organizational and strategic, not theatrical. The real wizards were intelligence officers and planners, not stage illusionists. The truth is more impressive than the myth, though less easily reduced to a simple story about a single colorful character. Understanding why Maskelyne created and maintained his fabricated legend requires considering the psychological factors that drive people to mythologize their own histories. This phenomenon is not unique to Maskelyne. Many people embellish their past accomplishments, especially when those accomplishments are difficult to verify and when embellishment serves psychological needs. For Maskelyne specifically, several factors likely contributed. First, there was the burden of family legacy. Being the grandson of John Neville Maskelyne meant carrying expectations of greatness. Jasper had never achieved the level of success in stage magic that his grandfather and father had. The war offered an opportunity to establish his own legendary status in a different arena. But when his actual wartime service proved to be routine rather than heroic, the temptation to embellish must have been strong. Exaggeration allowed him to fulfill the destiny implied by his family name. Second, the immediate post-war environment rewarded dramatic war stories. Britain was hungry for narratives of British ingenuity and triumph. The public wanted heroes, wanted stories that made the war seem like an adventure that British cleverness had won. Maskelyne's fabrications met this cultural need, and he was rewarded with attention, publication, and celebrity. The positive reinforcement for embellishment was immediate and substantial. Third, the difficulty of verification worked in Maskelyne's favor. Deception operations were classified. Many records were still restricted. The operations he described had occurred in North Africa, far from most British audiences. The people who could have contradicted his claims, fellow camouflage officers, force personnel, commanding officers, were scattered and not particularly interested in debunking an entertaining story that reflected well on British military prowess generally. Fourth, there's the phenomenon of autobiographical memory reconstruction. Psychological research shows that people don't remember their past accurately. They reconstruct it based on present needs and self-concept. Each time we recall an event, we potentially modify the memory. Over years of retelling his war experiences, Maskelyne may have genuinely come to remember himself as more central and more important than he actually was. The line between deliberate fabrication and sincere false memory is often blurry. Fifth, the theatrical mindset may have contributed. Magicians are professional creators of illusion who understand the power of narrative and presentation. Maskelyne had spent his life creating effects that audiences knew were illusions but chose to treat as real during performances. Perhaps he came to view his war stories similarly, as performances where strict factual accuracy mattered less than creating an entertaining and meaningful narrative. The fact that he was telling these stories about real events rather than stage performances may not have seemed like a crucial distinction to someone whose professional life had always blurred reality and illusion. None of these factors excuse the fabrications, but they make them comprehensible. Maskelyne was not a uniquely dishonest person. He was someone in whom various psychological and cultural factors aligned to create and reinforce self-mythologization. Similar processes have produced inflated war stories from thousands of veterans, though few achieved the scale and success of Maskelyne's myths. There's also the question of whether Maskelyne fully understood the implications of his fabrications. He may have thought he was simply making his real contributions sound more dramatic, not realizing, or not caring, that he was essentially appropriating credit for operations that others had actually planned and executed. From his perspective, he had been there, he had worked in camouflage, he knew about deception operations. Telling stories that made his role sound more important might have felt like legitimate embellishment rather than outright theft of credit. Additionally, once he had published Magic, Top Secret, and accepted recognition based on its claims, retracting or correcting the record became increasingly difficult. Admitting that he had exaggerated would have meant humiliation, financial consequences, the book's success depended on its apparent factuality, and the collapse of the reputation he had built. The psychological and practical costs of honesty became prohibitive, creating a trap where he had to maintain false claims or face devastating consequences. This analysis suggests that Maskelyne's fabrications, while ethically problematic, were the result of comprehensible human psychology rather than unique villainy. Many people, faced with similar pressures and opportunities, might have made similar choices. This doesn't forgive the fabrications, but it does help explain why they occurred and persisted. What lessons can be drawn from the Maskelyne story? Beyond its specific historical content, the case offers insights into how historical myths develop, why they persist, and what responsibilities we have toward historical truth. First, the case illustrates how difficult it can be to separate fact from fiction when dealing with recent history. Maskelyne's claims were made shortly after the war, when documentation was incomplete and often classified, when memories were fresh but also potentially self-serving, and when cultural factors encouraged uncritical acceptance of dramatic war stories. Even professional historians initially accepted his claims largely at face value. Only decades later, when more complete documentary records became available and when the cultural distance allowed more skeptical assessment, did the fabrications become clear. This suggests humility about claims regarding recent events. What seems obviously true in one era may be revealed as false in another. Second, the case demonstrates the power of narrative appeal in shaping popular historical understanding. Maskelyne's story succeeded because it was good storytelling. An individual hero, clever tricks, dramatic success, evil enemies outwitted. The true story of collective, bureaucratic, sophisticated deception operations is less narratively satisfying even though more impressive as actual achievement. Popular understanding of history often prefers good stories to complex truths, which means that myths can persist even after scholarly debunking. This has implications for historical education and communication. How can the true story be made as compelling as the false one? Third, the case raises questions about appropriate response to historical fabrications. Should historians spend significant effort debunking false claims, or should they focus on establishing what actually happened and let false claims fade through neglect? There's no clear answer. Debunking can inadvertently perpetuate the false claims by keeping them in circulation, but ignoring them allows myths to persist unchallenged. Different contexts may call for different approaches. Fourth, the case has implications for understanding how individuals interact with history. People want to see themselves as significant participants in important events. The temptation to exaggerate one's role or importance is strong, especially when exaggeration serves psychological needs and brings rewards. This suggests that personal accounts of historical events should always be approached with appropriate skepticism, even when told by apparent participants. Verification through multiple independent sources and documentary evidence is essential. Fifth, the case reminds us that ethical obligations toward truth persist even in storytelling. While Maskelyne might have viewed his fabrications as harmless embellishment or even as a kind of performance art, they had real consequences. Appropriating credit from those who actually did the work, distorting public understanding of how military operations actually function, and undermining historical accuracy. These harms matter, even if they don't seem as serious as other forms of dishonesty. Maskelyne's actual legacy is thus complicated and largely negative from a historical perspective. His most lasting contribution has been to confuse public understanding of wartime deception operations, overshadowing the genuine achievements of Clark, Barkas, and countless others with fabricated tales of his own importance. His memoir, while entertaining, has been an obstacle to historical understanding rather than a contribution to it. However, there's a more positive legacy worth noting. The very existence of the Maskelyne controversy has sparked broader public interest in actual deception operations. Efforts to debunk his claims have led historians to research and publicize the real history of British deception warfare, which is fascinating and deserves to be widely known. In this indirect sense, Maskelyne's fabrications may have ultimately served historical understanding by provoking investigation and discussion that has illuminated the truth. The case has also become a valuable teaching tool. Educators use the Maskelyne story to illustrate principles of historical criticism, the importance of primary sources, the challenges of memory and testimony, and the ways cultural factors influence what stories are believed and perpetuated. Students learning to think historically can practice their analytical skills by examining Maskelyne's claims, comparing them with documentary evidence, and understanding why the fabrications were initially believed and later debunked. For the magic community, Maskelyne's story offers both inspiration and caution. Inspiration comes from the idea that a magician's skills could potentially contribute to national defense. Even if Maskelyne's specific contributions were modest, the principle that illusion expertise has applications beyond entertainment is valid. Caution comes from seeing how fabrications, once exposed, can damage reputation and legacy. Maskelyne could have been remembered respectfully as a competent officer who did his duty in wartime. Instead, he's increasingly remembered as a fabulist who made false claims about his service. More than 50 years after Jasper Maskelyne's death, his story continues to generate debate and fascination. New books, articles, and documentaries continue to appear, each grappling with the question of who he really was and what he actually accomplished. The story refuses to be settled definitively, hovering in the ambiguous space between documented history and persistent myth. In the end, perhaps the most accurate statement about Jasper Maskelyne is that he was a magician who understood that the greatest illusion he could create was himself. The theatrical skills that had served him modestly on stage were deployed more successfully on the stage of history, where he transformed a routine military career into a legend of strategic deception and wartime heroism. The techniques of stage magic, misdirection, false perspective, exploiting assumptions, controlling perception, were indeed applicable to his own self-mythologization. He directed attention toward dramatic claims that were difficult to verify and away from mundane realities that were easily documented. He created a narrative where he appeared larger and more important than he was, exploiting the distance between observers and events. He understood what his audience wanted to believe and gave them stories that fulfilled those desires. In this sense, Maskelyne's greatest success was not in deceiving the Germans. There's little evidence he did that effectively, but in deceiving us. His illusion of the war magician who helped defeat the Nazis has proven remarkably durable, persisting in popular imagination despite scholarly debunking. That's an impressive feat of deception, though not the one he claimed. The story also serves as a reminder that history is never completely settled. The past is not simply what happened, but also what we believe happened, what we remember, what we choose to emphasize or forget. The Maskelyne legend succeeded because it served cultural needs, told a satisfying story, and occurred in a context where verification was difficult. The gradual historical correction has occurred because changed cultural contexts, new evidence, and scholarly dedication to accuracy eventually overcame initial credulity. For those who want simple heroes and simple stories, the Maskelyne legend remains appealing, a clever magician using theatrical tricks to help win the war. For those who want complex truth, the real story is available. A modest officer who did competent technical work, contributed marginally to successful operations, and then greatly exaggerated his role to create a false but entertaining legacy. Both stories say something true about human nature and about how we relate to history. The legend tells us what we want history to be, full of individual heroes whose cleverness and skill change great events. The truth tells us what history usually is, collective endeavor where individual contributions are real but limited, where success requires organization and coordination more than genius, and where the unglamorous work of many is more important than the dramatic gestures of few. Jasper Maskelyne stands at the intersection of these two versions of history, the mythic and the factual. His life spanned both the genuine achievements of the Maskelyne dynasty in theatrical magic and the fabricated achievements he claimed in wartime deception. He was a man who wanted desperately to live up to a famous name, who found in war an opportunity to create significance he couldn't achieve through his actual abilities, and who ultimately chose mythologization over honest accounting. Perhaps the final illusion Maskelyne created, the one that might have satisfied him most, is this: we're still talking about him. Decades after his death, his name still appears in histories of the war, documentaries still feature his story, and debates continue about what he did and didn't accomplish. He wanted to be significant, to be remembered, to make the Maskelyne name meaningful in a new way. Through fabrication and self-mythologization, he achieved that goal, even if the form of remembrance is not entirely what he might have hoped. The truth is less glamorous but more worthy of respect. Jasper Maskelyne was a British officer who served in the Royal Engineers during World War II, who contributed to camouflage operations in North Africa through competent technical work, and who then greatly exaggerated those contributions to create a legend that has both fascinated and misled the public for decades. His real contribution to history may ultimately be not what he did in the war but what his story teaches us about how myths are created, why they persist, and how difficult it can be to separate truth from illusion when both serve powerful human needs. The war magician performed his greatest trick not with mirrors and lights in the North African desert, but with words and stories in the decades afterward. And like all good magic tricks, even when you know how it's done, even when you understand it's an illusion, there remains something fascinating about the performance.